Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here in such a beautiful town, and it's an honor to have so many of you all come out tonight. So I'm going to talk about my book a bit, about my career, and about what I understand about men's reaction to combat, which is a complex thing. It's not simple. It's not probably what civilians expect. But it needs to be understood because these guys come home, and where I was, it was all men in the Korengal Valley. There were no women in uniform. These guys come home, and they barely understand their experience. And if we profoundly misunderstand it, it'll be very hard for us to make a place for them in society. So my book is partly an attempt to communicate what I understood out there. A few years ago, I read a biography of Daniel Boone. I can't remember the author, but it was a wonderful book, and there was a line in it, sentence that really struck me. The book was really about the Indian Wars in the Ohio River Valley. What must have been a just terrifying time for those people, small groups of Anglo settlers who crossed through the mountains and tried to settle in Kentucky. And they were really surrounded by hostile Indian tribes, and the warfare was bloody and atrocious and a complete nightmare. And they're really out there on their own. I mean, they can't call in air support. They are, whatever's going to happen is going to happen without anyone else's intervention. And the author cited a young woman who kept a journal during those terrible days. And she said about the Indian Wars, she said, the men and the dogs had a fine time. As always, it's the women who suffer. I was really struck by that. Like, what is it? I mean, the Indian Wars must have been a just hellish experience for everybody involved. And what is it about war that, in addition to traumatizing people and wrecking lives, what is it about war that many men also find tremendously compelling? The most exciting time in my life, that kind of thing. It's such a politically incorrect question to raise, but it has to be raised because it has to be understood. When I got back from my year in the Korengal, which I'll talk about in a moment, one of the guys I got very close to, the only guy, by the way, who chose to get out of the Army after this terrible deployment, huge casualties, tremendous hardship out there, he was the only guy in the entire platoon who had the chance to leave the Army and avoid another deployment who took it. He got out for some good reasons. Everyone else stayed in and went on to do at least another deployment. And he, in a weird way, he suffered more than everybody else who stayed in. I mean, he really went through hell when he came home. As bad as combat is, in some ways it's not as bad as trying to readjust to life in society as a young person. And we were very good friends out there. We remained good friends. He lived near New York, and so I invited, at one point, we stayed in touch, and I was trying to help him because I watched this sort of slow train wreck that he was going through. He's okay now, but we stayed very close. And I invited him to a dinner party with some friends of mine who, I'd finished the book. Some of my friends had read the manuscript, and they wanted to meet him, so I invited him to a dinner party, and this woman that I know said to him, she'd read the manuscript, and she said, "Brendan, tell me, was there anything at all that you miss about the experience out there?" And he looked at her without any irony at all, and he said, "Ma'am, I miss almost all of it." Mm. My book is really an attempt to explain his answer. Again, if we don't know what they miss, and if we don't understand that some of the things they miss are actually quite healthy and important to a young man's identity, if we don't understand those things, we can't offer viable substitutes back home for those experiences. My history as a journalist is, basically I've covered civil wars around the world for almost 20 years. I started in Bosnia, 1993. I went there as a freelancer. I was definitely on my way to being a failed writer and sort of muddled through my 20s. I worked as a climber for tree companies. I was an arborist. I worked, 80 feet in the air hanging on a rope, and, eventually the inevitable happened. I hit my leg with a chainsaw. I got hurt. Everyone in the business that I knew had been hurt in one form or another. it's funny, you're always scared of falling. You know, we're evolved, I think, to fear heights, but we're not evolved to fear chainsaws. And we should have, because it took a chunk out of my leg. And at any rate, I realized I got to do something extreme here to get my career going. And extreme meant going to Bosnia, and I just went. Like a lot of freelancers, I just went, and it did work out. I kind of figured it out. So I was in Bosnia, Sierra Leone, Liberia, Afghanistan, starting in 1996. One of the things that happens if you cover wars is you become very, very sensitized to the horrors of war, because you see them. You see them, you experience them, you carry the emotional consequences home with you. And journalists are a funny bunch. Like, in some ways, they're very exploited. They're very exploiting of wars because they're kind of feeding off it. Like, war reporters need wars to report on, or they don't have a job. Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, so that seems awful. It feels wrong. Maybe it is. I don't know. But it's also precisely those people who are the most sensitized to war. And so I grew up in Massachusetts, Cambridge, Massachusetts, very liberal family, in the wake of Vietnam, very anti-war, and et cetera, et cetera. I mean, you can imagine. And I went to a Montessori school in the '60s. It's like you can figure out the rest. And I developed a very complicated relationship with the use of force, because in all the wars I covered, they were stopped by the use of force. They were stopped when Western military powers intervened, sometimes by dropping bombs on people. In NATO, NATO dropped bombs they bombed the Serb positions around Sarajevo, and in a 3-week air campaign, ended a 3-year genocide that killed over 100,000 people just like you and me, people just like everyone in this room. And NATO didn't lose a single soldier. So from my perspective, I have a complicated and sometimes what feels like a contradictory reaction to war, because in the situations I've seen, the use of force actually is what is desperately needed. But then that runs afoul of a kind of pure pacifist impulse, which I think all of us have that impulse in us somewhere, and it runs afoul of that. It feels wrong to call in the bombers. And I don't really know what the answer is, but I'm just sort of giving you some background from my experience with organized violence. The same thing happened in Sierra Leone. The Brits showed up after several years of just horror show. I'm sure you all remember that war. And I think in 2 weeks, they lost one soldier. I think in 2 weeks they brought an end to the war. Liberia, where I was in 2003, absolutely the most frightening experience of my life. That war, I remember being in the streets of Monrovia while the rebels were attacking it. And there were a lot of casualties because the rebels were shelling the city and mortars were landing, and people were refugees were crowded into compounds in the city, and mortars were landing right in the middle of the refugee camps and killing people. It was just ghastly. It was absolutely awful. The bodies in the streets, and it was just awful, awful. And I was on the street at one point, and this crowd gathered around me, and there was an American warship offshore. You could see it anchored offshore. And this crowd gathered around me, and they got quite ugly. And they realized I was American. They got quite belligerent and really pretty terrifying. There's nothing more terrifying than a crowd, than a mob. And I was beginning to be the focus of that energy, right? You know what the problem was? The problem was they were angry. They were like, there's an American warship offshore. Why aren't you invading? Like, why are you letting us suffer? What are your soldiers for if not to do something? Just come help us stop this war. And that's a confusing message. That's a confusing message to get. Like, why don't you invade us? Eventually that's what happened. And like a company of U.S. Marines or something like that, it was a very small number, came ashore, and without firing a shot, ended that war. All sides kind of wanted it ended, and they just needed some higher power that would step in and sort of trigger that change. And so that war was ended without firing a shot. And I got back to the United States pretty traumatized by that experience, and very traumatized, actually. And I got back, and I remember I was riding the subway in New York City where I live, and there was some kid had some kind of radical newspaper he was reading, and I mean some newspaper that was like pretty out there, and it said, I remember the headline of one of the articles was, U.S. imperialist forces out of Liberia. And I just thought, oh my God, you're totally missing it. Like, the Liberians actually were desperate for us to be there. That's not really imperialism. But I wasn't going to have that conversation with them. But I'm just sort of laying this out because they're such important topics, and the obvious truths are not true. The obvious truths, just say no to war or whatever. Like, it's a beautiful sentiment, but in the world that we live in, it does not necessarily cover all situations. It doesn't cover Rwanda. In some ways, it doesn't cover Afghanistan. We can get to that. But at any rate, for the first time in my life in '07, I decided to follow a platoon of American soldiers. I had almost no experience with U.S. military. I'd always been with basically like disorganized militias in African countries, basically child soldiers. And this was my first experience with an organized military. And because I realized, I'd been in Afghanistan in '96, 2000, 2001, and what had started out as a sort of easy war, an easy victory, and with an enormous amount of gratitude by the Afghans for having been liberated from Taliban rule, enormous gratitude. What started as an easy and good thing, because of neglect, we really sort of like did not follow through. We moved on to Iraq, which I thought was strategically an enormous mistake. We moved on to Iraq and really left Afghanistan behind. And after some years, eventually the Taliban really gained traction. And by 2005, 2006, it was a real war. I mean, in '02, '03, it really wasn't. By 2005, 2006, it was a real fight. And I realized that we're going to be in there for a long time. And if not, if we pull out now, it's going to implode just like it did in the '90s, and there'll be an enormous amount of suffering by the Afghan people if we leave now. And a terrible dilemma, right? So I thought I'm going to spend a year following an American platoon, a platoon of American infantry. Platoon's about 30, 35 guys. And I wound up with Battle Company of the 173rd Airborne. Incredible unit. They were in the Korengal Valley. I'd never heard of the Korengal. It's 6 miles long, eastern part of the country in Kunar province. It's beautiful, beautiful land. It looks like Colorado. It's absolutely gorgeous. Battle Company had about 150 men. And while I was there, a fifth of all the combat in all of Afghanistan was happening in those 6 miles. 150 men in Battle Company were absorbing a fifth of all the combat for something like 70,000 NATO troops around the country. I was at an outpost, most of the time, I was at an outpost called Restrepo, OP Restrepo. It was named after the platoon medic, Juan Sebastian Restrepo, who was killed in action 2 months into the deployment. The company headquarters was kind of on low ground, and there were these ridges around it, and the enemy would come up the backsides of the ridges and shoot down. It's called plunging fire. Would shoot down into the company headquarters very, very effectively. And at one point, the battalion commander, Colonel Ostland, and Dan Kearney, the company commander, decided to put an OP up on that ridge, take it away from the enemy. And so one night, the men walked up there with pickaxes and shovels and their weapons, and they started hacking away at the rock. They had sandbags, but there was no sand up there. They had to hack away at the rock. They filled the sandbags with chunks of rock. They worked all night. When it got light, they were attacked. The attack lasted half an hour. When it finally ended, they went back to work, back to digging, and they dug in the 100-degree heat with full body armor, helmet, until the next attack. They were attacked 13 times that day. They worked and fought straight for 24 hours. And in the end, they had a little outpost. That's where that was one of my second home for off and on for a year, along with my colleague Tim Hetherington. There was no running water. They didn't bathe when they were up there, which was usually a month at a time. Every month they'd walk down to the company headquarters, 2-hour walk. They'd get a shower. They'd get a hot meal. It was just MREs up at Restrepo. They'd get a hot meal. They'd call their girlfriend, and then a few days later they'd head back out for another month. There was no internet up there. For a while there wasn't even electricity. They finally got a generator up there. The guys slept on the ground until they built little plywood hooches. They were so cramped. I I slept in the area where first squad was. That was kind of the guys I hung out with most, and I could from my bunk. I basically lived as they did. I basically became a soldier, except I carried a video camera, not a gun. But from my bunk, I could reach out and touch 3 other men with my arm. It was very, very cramped. Smelled pretty bad in the summer, it was basically cans of ammo and sandbags, and a lot of combat. They were in 400 firefights during their deployment. My first day up there, we were attacked 4 times. It was really rough, and there was an enormous amount of courage out there. I sort of went into this book. I went into this project not quite sure what I wanted to do, and pretty quickly I saw these amazing acts of courage, and I decided I wanted to know how courage works. On the face of it, it's such an odd choice, an odd thing to do. You risk your life. Darwin would say it's crazy. We operate to maximize our genetic fitness, to pass on our genes. These are 19, 20-year-olds who don't have kids for the most part, who are risking or sacrificing their lives for guys they're not related to. They're not saving their children, they're not saving their spouse, they're saving guys they're not related to, their peers. What's going on? How does this courage work? I got really interested in it, and ultimately I became interested basically in the emotional experience of combat. Politics of all this, I can talk about that, that's no problem. The morality, sure, we can talk about that. But the thing that the world the soldiers live in, they don't have those conversations. They don't have those experiences. They experience war emotionally. We don't. And I wanted to understand the emotional terrain. And I broke down the experience into 3 sections. My book is divided into 3 sections. The primary emotional experiences of combat, as I understood them. The three sections are fear, killing, and love. Love being the bond in the platoon that essentially allows these guys to overcome their tremendous fear, and also a natural human revulsion at killing. While I was out there, I was with 2nd Platoon. 1st Platoon, at one point in October '07, they were on a combat operation. They were ambushed at close range. They walked into an L-shaped ambush on a ridge called the Korengal Spur, and they walked into 15 men with machine guns and RPGs that opened fire at them from distances of from here to the window, very, very close. They basically walked into a shooting gallery at night. And you may have heard this story. The entire lead squad got hit, and the guy walking point, Josh Brennan, he was hit multiple times. And in the chaos, the Americans, they're really well trained, and so they returned fire. They started bounding forward, throwing hand grenades, and one young man, Sal Junta, he realized that his buddy Josh, he couldn't find him. He was walking point. A lot of gunfire was coming where Josh had been, and Sal got worried for him, and he ran forward into gunfire, getting hit by rounds in the plate, throwing hand grenades, and he ran forward, and he saw 2 men carrying off his best friends, wounded but alive. The ultimate nightmare, to be taken alive by the enemy, or at least that enemy, at night getting dragged off down the hill. And he ran forward, he killed the guys who were dragging off his friend, he pulled his friend to safety and protected him until the rest of the guys got there. Very, very tragically, Josh died on the medevac. He bled out. He was hit 8 times. It was not. He was dying. But what Sal did was avoid this terrible, terrible situation where had they succeeded, the military, not to mention Josh's family, wouldn't have known that whether he's dead or alive, and regardless, they would have to recover him, and it would have been a tremendous trauma for the family, and it would have triggered a brigade-wide effort looking for Josh, and then all of a sudden, helicopters are getting into trouble trying to fly at night in the mountains. You got 500 men walking around very, very dangerous terrain looking for this guy. things happen, more guys get wounded. Sal's act of courage saved an enormous amount of heartache and possibly lives. And I talked to him about it, and it was very interesting because he eventually was awarded the Medal of Honor, the first living recipient since Vietnam. And I talked with him out there about it because it was all pretty quickly. The rumor was he was being considered for this, and he was so ambivalent about it. You know, he was kind of mortified. He was like, "Listen, he was like, what I did wouldn't have worked if everyone else wasn't doing what they were doing, and anyone else who had been standing where I was standing at that moment would have done what I did. So why aren't we all getting the medal? Like, it's not." He was like, "I just did what we do. We're soldiers. Josh was my friend. Like, don't call it courage. He was my friend. You know, that's not courage. That's friendship." So I'm going to read a brief passage. I've actually never read this section before, but I don't know how many of you read the book. I hope not. I hope lots of you haven't, so that this isn't old material. I've never read this passage before, and I was just sort of looking through my book in the car on the way down here, and it just kind of struck me, and I wanted to read it. Heroism is hard to study in soldiers because they invariably claim that they acted like any good soldier would have. Among other things, heroism is a negation of the self. You're prepared to lose your own life for the sake of others. So in that sense, talking about how brave you were may be psychologically contradictory. Try telling a mother she was brave to run into traffic to save her kid. Civilians understand soldiers to have a kind of baseline duty, and that everything above that is considered bravery. Soldiers see it the other way around. Either you're doing your duty, or you're a coward. There's no other place to go. In 1908, 5 firemen died in a blaze in New York City. Speaking at the funeral, Chief Ed Croker had this to say about bravery. "Firemen are going to get killed. When they join the department, they face that fact. When a man becomes a fireman, his greatest act of bravery has been accomplished. What he does after that is all in the line of work." You don't have to be a soldier to experience the weird comfort of that approach. Courage seems daunting and hard to attain, but work is mundane and eminently doable, a collective process where everyone takes their chances. My work was journalism, not war, but the same principles applied. I was constantly monitoring my fear levels because I didn't want to freeze up at the wrong moment and create a problem, but it never happened. And after a couple of trips, I felt my fear just kind of go away. It wasn't that I was less afraid of dying, it was that dying made slightly more sense in the context of a group endeavor that I was slowly becoming part of. As a rule, I was way more scared in my bunk at night when I had the luxury of worrying about myself than on some hillside where I'd worry about all of us. Because I didn't carry a gun, I would always be relegated to a place outside the platoon, but that didn't mean I was unaffected by its gravitational pull. There was a power and logic to the group that overrode everyone's personal concerns, even mine, and somewhere in that loss of self could be found relief from the terrible worries about what might befall you. And it was pretty obvious that if things got bad enough, and there was no reason to think they couldn't, the distinction between journalist and soldier would become irrelevant. I should say that around that time, Chosen Company, just one valley, a couple of valleys to the north, they had a couple of very bad fights. And one of them, they sent out a 28-man platoon patrol. And on the way back from the village of Aranas, they were ambushed. Very effective ambush, 360-degree ambush. And they took, within a matter of minutes, every man had a bullet in him. 100% casualties in a matter of minutes. The wounded fought off the enemy until air power got there a few hours later. It was a terrible, terrible thing, and we all realized, Tim and myself and the soldiers, we all realized that that was a possible scenario. Restrepo was a 20-man position, and the enemy, if they had been willing to sustain the losses, they would have sustained huge losses, but they could have overrun it. They could have taken it. And potentially everyone up there could have been killed. One of the really comforting things, in a weird way, and I may be the first graduate of a Montessori school to ever say this sentence, but one of the really comforting things up there in light of that threat was all the weapons. Seriously. Like, that's what was keeping us alive. And you would start to kind of gaze at the 50 cal or at the Mark 19 with a real kind of fondness. Like, wow, that's the thing, that's the machine that means I'm going to go home to my wife, or whatever. But Tim and I didn't carry weapons, so there was like this weird, we had a weird relationship with those things too. As a reporter, it was hard to come to any kind of psychological accommodation with the weapons because they were everywhere. You couldn't sit on someone's bunk without moving an M4 or some grenades, and they only got more compelling as time went on. They had a kind of heavy perfection that made them impossible to ignore. What you really wanted to do was use them somehow, but that was so wildly forbidden that it took you a while to even admit you'd had the thought. I'm speaking as a civilian, as a journalist, and of course as a Montessori graduate. After that, you'd find yourself trying to imagine situations where it might be permissible without the obvious ethical problems. The only one I could come up with was a scenario that was so desperate and out of control, 100 Taliban fighters coming up the draw and through the wire, that picking up a gun would be simply a matter of survival. That was too horrific to actually hope for, so I didn't. But I'd find myself thinking that if it were to happen, I hoped I'd be there when it did. It's a foolish and embarrassing thought, but worth owning up to. Perfectly sane, good men have been drawn back to combat over and over again, and anyone interested in the idea of world peace would do well to know what they're looking for. Not killing necessarily, that couldn't have been clearer in my mind, but the other side of the equation, protecting. The defense of the tribe is an insanely compelling idea, and once you've been exposed to it, there's almost nothing else you'd rather do. The only reason any one of us was alive at Restrepo, or at Aranas, or at Ranch House, or later at Wanat, was because every man up there was willing to die defending it. In 2nd Platoon, Tim and I were the only ones who benefited from that arrangement for free, as it were, and it's hard to overstate the psychological significance of that. Once, Tim found himself throwing ammo to a couple of guys who were stuck behind a HESCO during a firefight, and that was as close as we ever got to actually doing anything. There was a debt that no one registered except the men who owed it, Tim in other words. Collective defense can be so compelling, so addictive, in fact, that eventually it becomes the rationale for why the group exists in the first place. I think almost every man at Restrepo secretly hoped the enemy would make a serious try at overrunning the place before the deployment came to an end. It was everyone's worst nightmare, but also the thing they hoped for most, some ultimate demonstration of the bond and fighting ability of the men. For sure there were guys who re-upped because something like that hadn't happened yet. After the men got back to Vicenza, they were based in Italy. After the men got back to Vicenza, I asked Bobby Wilson if he missed Restrepo at all. "I'd take a helicopter there tomorrow," he said, then leaning in a little softer. "Most of us would." I think what they're after, what they're longing for, what they're missing, I mean, there's a certain amount of adrenaline rush in all this, of course. They're young men. We all know young men particularly have a very alive sense of risk-taking. They're thrill seekers. They seek stimuli, and it often gets them killed. The death rate among young men from accidents and violence is astronomical compared to young women or compared to older men. Literally, statistically, a 20-year-old man is safer within the strictures of the fire department, the police department, and most of the units in the Army, for that matter, than they are just walking around doing the stupid stuff that young guys do. So there is that for sure. But then there's also this other thing which is more profound and I think more relevant, because after all, you can come back to society and still get your adrenaline rush. You can rob banks, you can skydive, whatever, you can do it. But the thing you can't get here that becomes so important out there is that bond. It's basically brotherhood. And brotherhood is different from friendship. Friendship's a wonderful thing. It exists in society. It's extremely important. But it's a function of how you feel about the other person, and those feelings can change depending on how the other person acts. And the more you like someone, the more you're willing to sacrifice for them. Brotherhood has nothing to do with how you feel. It's a kind of shared understanding, a shared agreement that every individual places the welfare of the group above their own personal welfare. And so when you hear this phrase, throw yourself on a hand grenade, that's kind of a cliche, right? But it happens. I mean, that has actually happened in war. And I think what it is, much like a parent and child, the idea of yourself dying is more acceptable, more palatable than the idea of protecting yourself and having everyone else die. That's the really intolerable thing, because what happens is if you succeed, you're condemned to living the rest of your life with that shameful knowledge and a complete betrayal of your brothers who you think, you believe, would have saved you had they been in your shoes. That's something that will ruin a person's life. And as a result, these guys, out of this bond, acted with tremendous courage, and that bond is so comforting. I mean, think about it. You're 19, you're 20 years old. Your value, your self-respect, your esteem within the group is based on entirely on how you act. And if you're a good soldier and you're self-sacrificing for your brothers, you get respect. And everyone has access to courage. You don't, no one's born brave. You can't buy bravery. It's one of the few things that every single person has access to being. In society, the way we're judged, particularly as teenagers, is based on things most of it's based on things you don't have much control over. Are you good looking, or are you ugly? Are you good from a good family or a poor family? Is your dad in prison? Whatever it may be. This is why being a teenager is so hellish, because you're being defined by others for things that you didn't choose and can't do much about. And then you take that person and you put him in combat, and his ultimate self-worth is determined by his actions. He's totally self-determining. For a 19-year-old, that's a good deal. And then you come back here, and you don't have a job, and you don't have that clear sense of purpose, that sense of utility, that clarity, and you don't necessarily have the respect of your peers. You're being judged for these other things, and it's hellish. And the guys stay in the army. They stay in a place which is psychologically comforting and understandable and clear to them. I'd like to take questions, but I'm going to just finish up with a note. My good friend and colleague Tim Hetherington, who I was out there with, we were there together sometimes. We were there separately together. We made our movie Restrepo. We were supposed to, we were nominated for an Oscar, and we didn't win. And a few weeks later, we were going to go to Libya to cover the war in Libya, and generally the Arab Spring, which is such an incredible thing, and I wanted to understand it. And in Misrata, in mid-April, in the city of Misrata on Tripoli Street, a single mortar hit a group of journalists, including Tim, and wounded most of them, and killed a wonderful photographer named Chris Hondros, and wounded my friend Tim. He was hit in the groin by a piece of shrapnel. He was still alive. They put him in the back of a truck, raced him towards the clinic. A Spanish photojournalist named Guillermo, who I've had the pleasure of getting to know since then, sat with him, holding his hand, trying to keep Tim awake because he kept falling asleep because he was bleeding out. And Tim would kind of fall asleep, and then Guillermo would rouse him again, and he just kept falling asleep longer and longer, and it was harder and harder to wake him up. And then his hand got cold, and Tim died. And so, it was something that affected me profoundly, and still is. I got some sense of what the soldiers used to talk about when they would say, if someone died out there, the soldiers would all try to figure out how it was their fault. I don't mean the guy who died, I mean their own fault. And they would go to incredible sort of contortions to sort of like make it their fault, and they had this terrible guilt. And I never quite understood it until I watched myself do it. I forgot to say this. I didn't go to Libya. For personal reasons, I wasn't able to go, and Tim continued on his own. He's a big boy, he's worked on his own many times, so I didn't think twice about it. But I was supposed to be there, and I didn't go. And I watched myself turn it into my fault, even from New York City, where I was. Like, I should have been there. Maybe I could have saved him, even if I undoubtedly would have been wounded too, but maybe less wounded. We've been trained by the platoon medic and how to, we were given med packs, and so we asked the medic to sort of teach us how to stop, use a tourniquet and chest decompression and all that sort of battlefield medicine stuff, and I was like, I should have been there. Maybe I could have saved him, and I got incredibly guilty about it. But it gave me a real insight into the soldiers. But I'll end with this. The day that I found out, such a terrible day, I was really in shock, and I got an email from a Vietnam vet who I'd met the previous summer when my book came out and Restrepo came out. I'd met him in Texas, and he was a great guy, and he sort of really liked the movie, and he liked the book, and so once in a while he'd email me to say hi. And so he sent me an email after he found out, and he said, "Sebastian, I'm so sorry for what happened." And he said, "I hope this doesn't sound callous, but I do need to tell you this." He said, "You guys, with your books and your movie, you got really close to understanding the war. You got really, really close." He said, "But you didn't get all the way." He said, "The core reality of war, the central truth of war, isn't that you might die. It's that you will lose your brothers. Losing your brothers, dying is not a certainty, but losing your brothers is. That is the core truth about war." And he said, "Until today, in some ways, you didn't know the first thing about war. And now you know everything you need to know about it." It was such a profound insight. And it's one that really made me feel like, okay, now I really understand about war. I don't think I need to cover it anymore. I think I sort of hit that point where I've understood it. And to understand war is to want to get as far away from it as possible. So I'd love to answer your questions if you have any. Thank you, I appreciate it. Yes, sir, in the back.
How close, if at all, were you to becoming injured or in a firefight yourself?
Oh, everyone out there was almost killed. I mean, I don't mean in an abstract way, but like in very specific ways. I mean, I was in a Humvee that got blown up. By some miracle, I had the video camera on. Before that, while we were rolling down the road, the bomb went off under the engine block instead of under us. It wasn't a terrifically powerful bomb. I think we would have survived it, but it would have messed us up pretty badly. In some ways, that's worse. That was one incident. Every trip I took out there, something happened. Another trip, I was leaning against some sandbags, and really quiet day, and some sand, some dirt flew into the side of my face. And I had just time to think, what the hell was that? And then I heard the gunfire. And you have to understand, the bullets go faster than sound. So if someone shoots at you from 400 meters or whatever, which was pretty typical out there, you've got a good half second between the bullets impacting around you and the sound that explains them. And bullets, without the sound of gunfire, bullets are kind of puzzling. I mean, you don't necessarily know that they're bullets. It's a weird snapping sound. It's like something's wrong in the air. It's kind of subtle. And when you get ambushed, like often the first thought in your mind is a question: what was that? Are we getting shot? And then you get halfway through that question, and then it answers itself. And so what I felt was a round that had impacted the sandbags a few inches from my head and sprayed dirt in my face. And the guy was shooting from 400 meters, and he missed me by a few inches. So what's the angle? What's the angle of deviation that saved my life? I mean, it's almost not calculable at 400 yards and a few inches. That's a puff of wind, whatever. And so you realize, and every guy out there had that story. I mean, after that firefight, I sort of realized, afterwards I kind of realized the implications of all this, which are pretty horrifying, because the implications are, wow, it's random. I mean, ultimately, you can believe in God, and you can have a nice family at home, and you can be a good person. None of it has anything to do with anything. It's random luck. And I was sort of wandering around digesting that, and sort of trying to tell my story to the boys, and I really couldn't have picked a worse group of guys to impress with that particular story, because every single one of them had that story and didn't want to be reminded of it. And so I saved that one for home when I got home. But that was the reality out there. And it was, I'm in my 40s, and realizing that death out there was random and arbitrary and no reflection on your worth as a person, that's hard enough in your 40s. Understanding that at 20 with another 60 years to get through as a human being in what feels like a completely heartless and arbitrary universe, like, no thank you. I got 30 years to get through with that terrible knowledge, and that feels like a burden. I can't imagine as a young person sort of digesting that and making peace with it. It's an awfully hard thing.
Has your hearing been affected?
My hearing has been affected, and I'll tell you why. Well, first of all, that stuff is just so damn loud. But I very foolishly wanted to shoot the mortar team in action, and they all sensibly blocked their ears after they dropped the round down the tube. But I'm holding the video camera, and so I can't. So I went through 10 rounds of 120 millimeter mortars with my ears wide open, and yeah, I had some hearing loss for sure. Yes, sir.
This is more of a political question, and it's not a facetious one, but where are all these Taliban coming from? I got the impression at the beginning of the war 10 years ago that they were a minority that took over the country, that the average person didn't like them. So how is it they're going on and on and on? The Ho Chi Minh Trail of
Right.
Pakistan, is that it?
Well, do you all hear the question? Where did the Taliban come from? Where did the Taliban come from? They were not well liked in the beginning. Their source of power is really the Pashtun population. The government, part of the problem, the government was dominated by Tajiks and Uzbeks, and the Pashtuns, and this is in the early 90s, after the Soviets withdrew, the Pashtuns felt very marginalized. They were marginalized. And so the heart of Taliban power is the Pashtun population. But as a fighting force, the Taliban come from Pakistan. That's not to say that there aren't Afghan Taliban. And there's a whole sort of spectrum of Taliban fighters. At the very bottom are local guys, 17, 18 years old. They're paid a few dollars by the Taliban. They're given an AK and a couple of magazines and told to go shoot at the Americans. And if they survive it, they're given $5. And it's a very poor country, and it's a very poor valley, and that passes for a good deal. And then on up from there, there were these sort of local timber. There was a lot of timber cutting up there. It was a very valuable resource. And huge, almost like sequoias, like huge trees in the upper elevations. And those timber crews were sort of out of work, and they basically became sort of private armies for the very, very wealthy men who owned that timber. Really, really wealthy guys. And so then they were sometimes they fought each other, but they were much better organized, better fighters. Then there were Pakistani volunteers, like real Pakistanis, who were trained in the madrasas, trained by the ISI, Pakistani intelligence, and sent across to fight in Afghanistan. And often they would stop in the Korengal for many of the same reasons that the journalists would. Like, I heard, after Tim and I were there, I heard that the Korengal, it got to be kind of famous, like kind of well known, and because basically it's a guaranteed firefight. And there are lots of war reporters who haven't really been in combat. I mean, you can cover war without being in combat. In some ways, it's a better way to do it. But it's a source of, frankly, a source of insecurity. And everyone knew if you went to the Korengal for a week, you were guaranteed to get into combat. And so the journalists would kind of go there to get their ticket punched and to get some dramatic footage. But the Taliban were doing the same thing. They had to train up their fighter. You can train fighters, but combat is combat. And they knew if they sent them through the Korengal, they had a kind of baptism of fire. So they send 20 men at a time. 15 of them would survive, and those 15 have experienced combat, and they'd send them on to other areas in Afghanistan. So the Korengal almost became it was sort of a shooting gallery. It was almost a kind of training ground for everybody. It was really bizarre. It had other significance as well. It wasn't just about that, and I can talk about that if you want. But that was going on. And then finally, in the Taliban, you've got these really serious groups, like Gulbuddin Hekmatyar's group, Hig, and he was from the jihad against the Soviets, a really hardcore guy, very serious fighters. And then there was Chechens and Saudis, Arabs, who were tactically the equal of the Americans. They didn't have air power, but in every other sense. I mean, they had night vision goggles, ammo racks, bulletproof vests. I mean, and just tactically, they were extremely well trained. And the Americans were, if you heard the Chechens were in the valley, like that was cause for some serious alarm. So that was sort of this the spectrum, and in the Korengal, and on a given day, it might be 3 kids with AKs, or it might be the Chechens, and you never quite knew. It was depending on what plans the enemy had. You know, the enemy makes plans as well. They're not just reactive. So, yes, ma'am.
Restrepo showed such a marvelous esprit de corps that it seemed evident that you would want that, because that doesn't happen in real life. And it happens in that kind of situation where there's grief and relief and unity.
Yeah, the lady was just commenting that the movie Restrepo, it showed this sort of group bond very clearly, and she was just saying that it to her at least, it's sort of obvious, like why for a young person that might be an attractive thing, as rough as it was out there. Is that roughly?
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
I don't want to say school teacher.
Oh, all right, all right.
What I really appreciated about your book was how you described some of the young men and their families and incredibly dysfunctional. So
Yeah.
it made me really understand why they were support and why this family gave them a sense of community, especially when their own father, young
Right.
people, went to give them all their advice when they go to prison.
Yeah. The lady was saying that some of these guys are from very dysfunctional families, and that the military and the platoon, you know, really becomes a second, or he actually becomes a primary family in some ways, and that she was just understanding the draw that would have. You know, one of those guys was Brendan O'Byrne. I mean, dysfunctional family, my God. I mean, he, like, you know, as a teenager, he was such a troubled kid. He was an alcoholic. His dad was an alcoholic. They got into some pretty tough fights, I mean, like real fights. And his dad shot him twice during one fight. And not entirely on purpose, but still, there were 2 bullets in Brendan. And Brendan didn't want, he didn't want his dad to go to prison. I mean, his dad would have been in prison for 20 years. And, you know, as he said, whatever my dad's problems were, he always supported the family. And if he goes to prison, what do we do? So he told the cops that he had attacked his father, and his father had shot him, that he was going to kill his dad, and his dad shot him in self-defense. And that way, Brendan went to reform school with 2 bullets in him, and his dad stayed out of prison. Very, I mean, just incredible thing to do. And that tragedy actually precipitated some very good changes in the family. But you know, Brendan got into the Army like people climb onto a lifeboat. I mean, the Army saved Brendan because he was a kid. He was such a troubled kid. He was going to die. I mean, he was either going to die or go to prison. And so that's the. But then there were guys who were from tremendously good families and happy childhoods, and it was generally the guys from the most stable backgrounds who suffered the least PTSD. And the guys who had trauma before they went into the military had much more trouble afterwards. It sort of compounded whatever their issues were. You know, and at 18, whatever issues you have not been resolved yet. I mean, you're 18. And so you take someone at 18, they're still working on it, and then you put them in combat, and it really multiplies the effect, and it makes it very, very hard for these guys. Oh, and Brendan's doing really well now. He actually, it took a while. I mean, he was literally in more danger afterwards, just danger to himself, than his buddies were who stayed in the Army and deployed again. I mean, literally, I think he was in mortal danger. It was incredible. Let me get someone in the back. Yes, sir, yellow shirt, yes.
In all the reports we got from the casualty list, we noticed that the Army had more casualties than, say, the Marines. Were they just deployed differently, or were they trained differently? Why was that such a difference between the Army and the Marines?
Y'all heard the question? Yeah. You know, unfortunately, I think the Marines have caught up. I mean, I don't know. I haven't seen the numbers. Maybe they were being used differently, but you know, in the surge, I think that was primarily the Marines, and they really took a beating down in Helmand and Kandahar. So I don't quite know where those numbers are. I'm not sure there's a real significance in them. Yes, sir. Yellow shirt. Yeah.
2 questions. First, I'm wondering if that protective brotherhood that you alluded to came to include you, and if it did, how you carried the burden of knowing that the soldiers might sacrifice themselves or their missions, you know, for you. And then secondly, kind of a different question, I'm curious if you think that what you refer to as the strategic error of Iraq, will it politically inhibit us from doing the kind of more just or necessary wars of
You all heard the question?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, all right. I guess to answer the first question, as I became part of the platoon, I think one of the reasons that happened was because they understood that the loyalty, the growing loyalty between this group of young guys and these two strange older men who showed up, and like the loyalty went both ways, and it was very, very clear in my mind. I mean, I got really fond of those guys, and the idea of any of them getting hurt was kind of intolerable to me, and it made being home very difficult. They described being on leave very difficult. As pleasurable as leave was, and you got to understand at that outpost, I mean, nothing that young men like was out there. I mean, there was no girls, there was no alcohol, there was no drugs, there was no cars, there was no sport. I mean, it was nothing, right? And leave was filled with all those things, as you might imagine. And it was quite a hard time for them because they just worried about their brothers. Like, what happens? Jesus, what happens if Restrepo gets overrun and I'm not there to help? Just intolerable idea and a lifetime of guilt. And I didn't have it like that, but I had a civilian sort of version of it, and so, I think it was never tested, but I think they understood that I was willing to meet them halfway on that deal, and also, you get, when someone has a problem, if they get hit, that casualty becomes an enormous liability for the platoon, just tactically. You got to the guy can't walk, he's either dead or he's wounded, he can't walk, you got to get him out of there. So a lot of effort goes into keeping that from happening. A lot of effort that looks like and is courage, but it's also quite practical. And one of the reasons Tim and I wanted to be sort of trained in battlefield medicine was so that if we wound up in a situation like Chosen Company went through, that we could help. That we could help keep someone from bleeding out. And we asked to be trained on all the weapons. Because I was like, God, if we were with Chosen Company and their experience, half the men are combat ineffective, Tim and I are going to be doing something, and we better know how to do it. And at that point, you've completely crossed any journalistic ethical issue, and you're in a completely different terrain of human survival. And so we had no problems with having to, if it came down to it, we had no ethical problems with doing that. We wanted to know actually how to operate the weapon. So I think the guys sort of, and then Tim, just as an example, Tim, on one combat operation, Operation Rock Avalanche, I wasn't there. It was his trip. We alternated. I ruptured my Achilles out there, and so I had to sort of go home and fix it. And so he took the next trip, and he broke his leg at the top of the Abusgar Ridge. 10,000 feet, 9,000 feet. And they walked, they had to get out of there. They'd already taken casualties. They'd already been out there almost a week. It was right before Sal Junta did his thing. It was a terrible week. And they had to walk down the mountain at night. And Tim, his foot got wedged between two rocks. He had, 80, 90 pounds of gear on him, and he went over sideways and snapped his leg. And fractured his fibula, I guess. And the medic was like, oh, don't worry about it, it's only sprained. But, Tim could hear it crunching. I mean, he knew damn well it wasn't sprained. And he walked the entire night on a broken leg to get down off that mountain. The boys couldn't carry him, and they couldn't get a medevac in there, and staying put, because he was going to be a crybaby about it, might have gotten someone killed. And so soldiers register that. They might not comment on it, but they do register, and I got blown up, and I wasn't hurt, but it was a pretty frightening experience. And I went back. I just kept going back. So they kind of understood that we were in it with them, and so that that understanding that we would help each other actually was reciprocal. And just to answer your other question, Iraq, some good things came out of it, some unfortunate things happened, a lot of mistakes were made. In the end, maybe it'll all work out, I don't know. But it did muddy the waters tremendously about armed intervention. I grew up in the 80s when the big liberal concern was, human dignity, in Salvador and Guatemala, what are these civil wars, human rights abuse in these like in these countries, and like that was the big liberal concern. And so when Bosnia happened, for me, NATO getting the Serbs, using weapons to get the Serbs to stop killing civilians, 100,000 people had died at that point. NATO using weapons to get the Serbs to end the war, it wasn't just the Serbs, but to end the war, for me, that was that was right in line with a liberal agenda about human rights and human suffering. Like for me, there was no conflict at all. And now for me personally, one of the really complicated things that's happened is the Iraq war sort of like twisted that. And so what I hear from my liberal friends now is a really quite isolationist position about suffering in other countries. It's really kind of bizarre. Like it's very different from the 80s. And so now with Libya, NATO's doing the right thing in Libya. We avoided a bloodbath in Benghazi. I mean, here you have the ruler of a country with a modern army at his disposal, like vowing a bloodbath of his own people in one of his cities. And if that doesn't trigger humanitarian concern in us, both conservatives and liberals, and that doesn't trigger a NATO response, like what do we have NATO for? But I'll wind up in conversations with some of my liberal friends. They're like, oh, imperialist aggression in Libya. I'm like, what are you talking about? It's not imperialist aggression. Like, come on, like back it off a bit. And so, I think you're right. I think it has sort of scrambled the conventional thinking on both sides of the aisle in a way that's certainly confusing to me and probably confusing to everybody. Oh God, I never can pick. Yes.
So yeah, since we got back to that topic of sort of humanitarian war making, I was wondering, and you mentioned the point about, needing to understand what the soldiers are going through in the field during combat in order to prevent war or to, try and think about alternatives. And I was just wondering if you could elaborate on that point or what you might have learned from this experience about, how we might work towards cooperation now that we with this new understanding of what soldiers are going through.
So the question is, given this sort of often male response to war, how do you stop war? Like what? The reality is, in Western countries, wars start because governments decide to go to war. Men of my generation and older decide to go to war and send men half their age. What that response, that positive response to the test of war, makes it possible, psychologically, physically possible for those young men to actually carry out the orders. But the decision to go to war is made by an older generation, and that's in the Western world. In some of the civil wars that I covered in Africa, there are Charles Taylor was a very violent, manipulative leader who started the war in Sierra Leone and had a bad role to play in his own country. But a certain amount of the dynamic of conflict in those countries really is just simply young guys with guns. And you can hit it at the top level where guys like Taylor are making decisions, but there is a certain level to it, and you see that level in street gangs, you see it in fistfights in playgrounds. I mean, it's part of human nature. And trying to disavow it and say, oh, no, war is just it's a product of, we're being manipulated by the military-industrial complex, and without those bastards, we'd all be peaceful in Libya. It's just not true. And as long as we disavow the violent, the capacity for armed combat in young men, as long as we disavow it and say, no, it's not really there, it's just a kind of aberration, we'll never be able to get a handle on it. That response, like many other traits, is a product of evolution, and it kept, our species evolved in a very, very dangerous world with predators and groups of rival humans who were willing to kill our group for our females and for our food, or for our resources, actually, is what it typically was. And so we are here in part because of that response to threat, to perceived threat. It's an old and honored part of our genetic history, and it's got to be dealt with, but you really don't want to pretend it's just not there, because then you don't have a chance of sort of turning it in a positive direction in a very different world. I mean, we live in a very different world than we evolved in. So, you know, like, it's there, we got to bend it. We got to bend it in a better direction. I think you can, but it is something that needs to be understood. Yes, sir. Yeah, right there, yeah.
Oh, me.
You, yeah.
Okay. You brought up the issue of the brotherhood experience on the battlefield, and then the real tremendously hard time transitioning back to civilian life. Maybe you could talk a little bit, give us some more insights about that, how we might be able to help in some way. And before that, let me just say that I asked a Vietnam veteran friend of mine who experienced a lot of battle about transitioning back. He says, I don't know much about transitioning, but I compartmentalized. The Vietnam experience is always there, but somehow that's how he dealt with coming back. I'm just trying to understand ways we might be of more help to these people.
Well, it's a very tough thing, and they're compartmentalized about it because the society is compartmentalized about it. You know, I mean, we wage war, right? As a society, sometimes the population feels that it's just. Sometimes some of us feel that it's not. But the reality is, we wage war, right? So we fought what I think many people consider to be a necessary and just war in World War II to defeat the Nazis, who were doing horrible things to their fellow humans. And we firebombed German cities and incinerated 80,000 civilians, right? The society is not owning that. And I'm not saying we're right or wrong. I'm just pointing it out that when we think about World War II on Veterans Day or whatever, we don't really take that reality into our thinking. So if we're not doing it as a society, why the hell should the bomber pilots who did that be uncompartmentalized? Why would they do that? It's too painful. And so I think, look, wars happen, and some of them have to be fought. And I'm not arguing for a completely pacifist society, because I don't think it's possible. And if you could somehow pull it off, I think you'd be overrun by another country. So I'm not arguing for that, but we do need to sort of own the uglier aspects of war so that our veterans can make some peace with it. I was reading a book. It was basically an oral history of the Indian Wars in the Northern Plains. And basically, the young Indian Sioux and Cheyenne fighters who wiped out Custer. Those guys lived on. Those guys lived on into the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s. The last guy died. The last guy who fought Custer died in the 1950s. Pretty amazing, right? I mean, you think about it, it's extraordinary. I mean, he was shooting arrows at the U.S. cavalry in Montana, and then it's 1950, and we're getting ready with the space program. I mean, it's crazy. But anyway, so someone interviewed those guys, and one guy talked about the first time he killed someone. He was 16 years old, and his village was attacked. I think he was Sioux, and his village was attacked. I think the Blackfeet, I can't remember. It was a while ago that I read it, but his village was attacked, and he grabbed. This is his big chance. He wants to be a warrior. He's 16 years old. He is ready to go. He's just like the guys in the platoon, right? Same stuff. So he grabbed his bow. He ran out to defend the village, and he saw some movement in the brush, and he shot. He was an enemy fighter, and he shot, and he killed the enemy fighter. And he rushed forward to take the guy's scalp. And to his horror, he realized it was a teenage girl, and she had joined the fighters and she was armed and had participated in the attack, but he had killed a girl. And he said that for the rest of his life, he dreamed about her face. At night, he would dream and see her face. He had PTSD. We didn't invent PTSD. It's been around for a long time. And you think about it, like, the Sioux, the Cheyenne, the Blackfeet, they knew how to fight. I mean, I don't mean tactically. I mean ritually. They knew that when you go out and pollute yourself spiritually by killing other people, you need to be cleansed. The society needs to help you come to terms with it and cleanse you and make you understand that it was an unpleasant but necessary job that you did for other people. That's what those rituals are for. And even in a highly ritualized society like the Plains Indians in the 1870s, even they failed to quite deal with that guy's PTSD, right? We have no rituals at all. None. And it's one of the ways in which our society, as wealthy as we are, is actually tremendously impoverished. So if the Sioux can't do it, we sure as hell aren't going to be able to do it. And I think, maybe we can, but we're not going to be able to do it with the skill sets that we have right now. And I think we really have to think very hard as a nation, particularly in this politically divisive climate we're in, where, I'm typifying people here, but, in my opinion, the far right basically, will not have any conversation about whether American soldiers can do any wrong. They can do no wrong, right? It's American exceptionalism, and, that's, the far left is equally obnoxious. They're like, the American military can do no right. It's like, if you're a soldier, it's ridiculous at both ends. And what nobody is doing is really owning the occasional necessity for the use of force and the horrors that result. Nobody on either side is really acknowledging either. And that, as a society, I think we have to engage with it. And if we do that, I know it's a long-winded explanation, and I think it's a generational task. It's not something we're going to do next year. But I think as a nation, we do have to start that, because there is what Jung called the shadow, right? There's a darkness, there's a violence, there's a darkness in all of us and in our society and in every society. And if you don't own it, it owns you. And I think as a society, we have to kind of sort of begin that process. Just someone tell me if I'm going too long, because I'm happy to talk all night long, but are we?
Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi there. I have two questions.
Right.
One is, I have a family friend that came back from war and was
Speak up a little. Can you speak up a little?
Yeah, sure. I have a family friend that came back from war, and he told me about violence after war, and what he got into some conflicts after war. I was wondering if you knew of anything like that happened when any of the soldiers you experienced with combat, and then also I was wondering where the Taliban were getting their weapons from, if we have any intelligence.
Weapons are easy to get. There's weapons all over the place. They're coming in through Pakistan. A lot of them I think are Chinese made, but that doesn't mean the Chinese are sending them. There's just a huge arms market in the world, and weapons are pretty easy to get. As far as violence after deployments, the only guy I know who got out was Brendan O'Byrne, and one of the problems he was having is that he couldn't walk past a fire hydrant without getting into a fight with it. He was just incredibly confrontational, and so yeah, there was a lot of that, and he drank and drove and just everything. He had I don't think he'd care if I told this story. He had a car. He's totally cleaned up now. He's not drinking. He's good, and he really is good. But there was some dark days, and one of them was he was drinking and he was driving and he crashed his car into a tree, and the ambulance showed up and he got into a fight with the medic. That kind of thing. So let's see. Yes, sir, right there. Yeah.
You talk about dysfunctional families. We've got an enemy that's ready to train people to kill themselves. Do you have any insights about that? What are we going to do about this enemy that we have right now? Why are they forming that kind of a brotherhood to that extent that they're willing to do that? To take those kinds of measures. How do we get back? Yeah. They're brainwashed. What do we do about it?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. A lot of that inculcation happens in the madrasas in Pakistan, and they get these young boys, mainly boys. What they will do is they will go to very poor families and say, we will we'll take your eldest son and we'll educate him. But they're educating them in basically in the Wahhabi sect of Islam, which is really, really radical and frankly quite violent. And that was imported basically from Saudi Arabia. A lot of the money that went into paying for the madrasas in the 1980s, a lot of the money came from Saudi Arabia. And so with that money came the Wahhabi approach. And so that's what you got. It's not, the Pakistanis themselves are not, I mean, they're not particularly radicalized. But the young, the children who go through these madrasas come out radicalized. And the ones, the ones who seem most predisposed towards being suicide bombers are groomed for it and taught that it's glorious. And for a 16-year-old or 18-year-old from a really, really poor family in Pakistan who's been educated and inculcated and given this chance to serve his religion against the imperialist dogs, and et cetera, et cetera. I mean, what's not to like, for that kid? And so they go off and do it. And so I think, as with many, many problems in the world, the solution is education. The solution, the current generation's already lost. Like, it's the next generation, it's the 8-year-olds now. Like, we have to look forward. We have to look ahead. It's the 8-year-olds in countries like Pakistan who need to be saved, so that our next generation isn't going through this. But that's the problem. Like, you educate children in a good way, and they have humanist values, and you educate them in a violent way, and they won't. An 8-year-old is wide open, and he will become whatever we as a society want him to become. And I don't know how you change the schools in Pakistan, but that is the problem. Yes, ma'am.
Do you understand what the goal is in Afghanistan? Or what would success look like?
Oh, the easy questions last. Oh, awesome. Right.
We've learned 10 years, and like that young man that was awarded the Medal of Honor, when you looked at the circumstances that they're faced with,
yeah.
The things you've been describing tonight,
yeah.
What's up?
All right. Lock the door, because this is going to take a while. No, it won't take a while. I'll try to be simple and clear, and maybe I'll make this the last question. The war. I'm sorry. The question. No, you must have wondered why I said lock the door. The question was, where is this going in Afghanistan? Why are we there, and how do we get out? Basically, right?
What does success look like?
What does success look like? Okay. The closest analogy I can come to with this is the war on crime or the war on drugs. I mean, just as a matter of definition, you're never going to win the war on crime. So the question becomes, what are the best choices we can make to mitigate the effects of crime on society? Okay? So are we going to, quote, win in Afghanistan? In the military sense, no, because there will always be more recruits coming from Pakistan, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We have a finger in the dike, but eventually we have to sort of stop the flow of water, and then we can leave. And so ultimately, the U.S. military, they're very smart. They are very adaptive. They've had a decade to figure this out, and they have, tactically, on the ground, they have really begun to figure out a lot of the problems of fighting an insurgency in a very rugged country. The problem is the government. So I was asked by a senator who wanted to talk to me about Afghanistan, basically what I felt about the situation, and I said, look, well, I got a question for you. Like, why is it, you have to answer the question, why is it that one Taliban fighter is worth about 10 ANA? The ANA is the Afghan National Army. They're the same people, they're using the same weapons. Why is it one Taliban fighter is worth like 10 ANA? And he said, well, it's because they believe in what they're fighting for. I said, exactly. I said, the Afghans are fighting for a corrupt government that is stealing the people blind, and they know it's a completely self-serving criminal syndicate, basically, right? So I said to this senator, would you die defending Hamid Karzai? And he said, well, no, obviously not. I said, well, we can't leave until the Afghans are willing to fight and die for their own country, just like they did when they drove the Soviets out. And they're not going to do that if the government we're offering them to sacrifice themselves for is Hamid Karzai. It's not going to happen. So that what really has to happen, what does success look like? Success looks like either a change of government or pressure on the current government where there are real gains made in corruption and criminality in the government, gains that are registered by the Afghan population where they start to take pride in their government. Is right now they're like, I'm not dying for that. If you people want to die for that, be our guest, but we're not dying for that. And so I think ultimately the solution has to be a political one. And we went on with the senator. I went on. He's like, okay, well, how do we do that? I said, look, every time we try to crack down on corruption, Karzai steps in and blocks the investigation. He put the head investigator for corruption in prison because he was investigating corruption. He put him in prison. And we ignore it. It's a completely dysfunctional relationship, right? We ignore it, right? Because we think we need Hamid Karzai. Actually, he needs us more than we need him. And what I said, listen, Senator, I know this is pretty radical, but if we leave Afghanistan, he dies. He will not survive us leaving. There will be a civil war, and he will at least be kicked out, if not killed. And I think what we have to do in a very public way is say to Karzai and to the Afghan people, and for that matter to the American people, unless you do this, 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 and this to fight corruption, we are leaving next summer, and you can figure it out on your own. He will not call our bluff, because if he does, he's dead. And it has the advantage of making us look like we are fighting for good principles. And right now, it doesn't look that way to the Afghans, at least, you know. And my perspective on Afghanistan is, and I mean, I didn't say this before, and I usually do. You have to understand, I was there in the 1990s. After the Soviets withdrew, that country just melted down. It's filled full of weapons that we'd given them. When the Soviets pulled out, we pulled out. We didn't stay around to build roads and whatever. We pulled out as fast as the Soviets did. It just imploded into a bloody civil war. 400,000 civilians were killed in the 1990s in Afghanistan. Okay, 400,000. That era ended with 9/11, and in some ways, our tragedy was their good luck, because NATO. That era ended with NATO, with the U.S. and NATO. In the decade since NATO has been in Afghanistan, the highest estimates of civilian casualties are around 30,000. 2/3 of them killed by the Taliban. So you've gone from 400,000 to 30,000. The reason we're being tolerated in Afghanistan at all, despite all of our mistakes, is because the Afghans know that if we leave tomorrow, it goes back to the 1990s. And it's a bitter pill to swallow, but they're practical people, and for the most part, it keeps them not happy, but at least moderately cooperative. And so I guess I would just end by saying, if the solution, if leaving meant the war ending, I would be the first to say, let's get the hell out of there. The tragedy, the conundrum, the agonizing question for all of us is that it will have exactly the opposite results. So for a person who wants peace, who's concerned about human life, you wind up in a position where you're advocating military force. It just can make you crazy, right? It is making us crazy. It's extremely confusing, but that's the situation we're in. But the long and short of it is, I think we have figured out the tactical problems. I think if we don't tackle the corruption, we'll be there forever. We don't want to be there forever. The Afghans sure as hell don't want us to be. And so that really is the next step, I think, is confronting Karzai in a really radical way and saying, it's now or never. You better shape up. Thank you very much. It was a real pleasure talking to you.
I just ask, we do have plenty of books to sell if you do need a book. And if you'd like one signed, we're going to set Sebastian up here at a table. But when you do, if you stand up, if you could fold up your chair and put it to the side so that we have some space, it'd be great.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks.
Just escape. Oh, no, I can do it in transaction too. Is that all right?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
No, I always feel it.
If you're in the book club, it's basically just a membership program. So if you shop here regularly, qualifying books, once you spend 300, you get a... Okay, sure.